A warm welcome to everyone for today's webinar from the Institute of Foreign Affairs and Trade. My name is Gergely Varga. I'm a senior research fellow of the Institute and program director for the Euro-Atlantic program. And today our topic will be, what has the EU ever done for us? The EU's role in and response to the coronavirus pandemic and online discussion. So it's a great honor and pleasure for me to host this afternoon's discussion. I believe we have an excellent panel with us today to discuss how the EU has been coping with the pandemic, whether the EU has stood up to its task in the past 2 to 3 months with regards to the enormous challenges, economic challenges, political challenges, social and healthcare challenges posed by this severe pandemic and epidemiology crisis. So with us to discuss all these issues, we have an excellent panel from 3 different countries. I would like to introduce now our special speakers, our guest, Eleonora Poli. She is a researcher at the Istituto Affari Internazionali from Rome in Italy. She's working on research projects dealing with the EU economic policies and the political and institutional implications of EU financial and economic policies. Here with us is also Rem Korteweg from the Netherlands, from the Clingendael Institute of International Relations, and he works primarily on Europe's strategic role in the world, with a special focus on the intersection between foreign policy, trade, and security issues. And last but not least, we also have my colleague Tamás Molnár. He's a researcher of the Institute of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Budapest, and his research focus is primarily aimed at political systems and foreign policy of German-speaking countries and EU politics and institutions. So, as many of you might have seen and understood the theme of our today's panel, what has the EU ever done for us? We took out a reference from a famous theme of the famous movie, The Life of Brian, where where several people are debating in ancient time Palestine, well, what have the Romans have ever done for us? And as they are conspiring and throwing criticism against the empire, more and more issues come up where they realize that, well, the Romans have built bridges, they have brought a sanitary system, they have provided education, and at times it seemed that all the arguments and debates about the EU has a similar connotation. We tend to miss some of those basic goods, some of those basic benefits which the European Union provides us as Europeans, as European member states, which we take for granted, but however, which we shouldn't take for granted, which has come about only with hard work, with hard diplomacy, with continued decades-long efforts by the member states and by the European citizens. Meanwhile, it is fair to say that in times of crisis, the EU has not stood up to its task. And recently, it was President of the Commission, von der Leyen herself, who gave a public apology several weeks ago about the EU's failure, and especially about the Commission's failure in the first couple of weeks of the crisis. concerning how European institutions have failed to deliver, have failed to provide meaningful help for countries coping with the crisis. So my initial question for our panelists would be, as we agreed upon, there will be 7 to 8 minutes introductory remarks given to all our speakers to speak about what were the core strengths and weaknesses of the European Union and the EU institutions in the past 2 months with regards to this unprecedented situation. So first I would like to give the floor to Eleonora. So please, the floor is yours.
Hello everybody, and thank you for this invitation. I think it's going to be interesting to discuss about the EU and what the EU is doing today. Well, I think it's quite difficult to see whether the EU has been successful or it has been failing in deliver proper reforms. I think we're going to discover the effectiveness of its actions in different fields like sanitary, economic, and political after in a month or two. What I can see standing from Italy is that on the one hand, we have a general perception of the European Union as, again, a bureaucratic body which is not able to understand the problems citizens are facing. This is, in general, the main perception we got from citizens in Italy, not my personal perception. On the other, I have to admit that the initial response the EU gave to the crisis, to this unprecedented crisis, was quite feeble. Like, we didn't have a strong answer from EU institutions and also from member countries. In the initial part, we saw many member countries basically concentrating on themselves. It can be normal. There was a lack of solidarity and a lack of coordination by European institutions on a unique answer. This has changed. I can see that European institutions, European member states are now trying to find, a common answer to the crisis, if not solution, from different point of view. Like, we had proper economic planning, we are discussing proper economic and financial solutions, and we are also trying to find some kind of coordination in any health measure that have to be taken. Still, steps have to be done, but this is part also of a general decision of what we want the EU to become. Because at the moment, the EU has no power in many fields. For instance, on what concerns the national health system, this is up to member states to decide how they want to conduct their national policies. The EU might coordinate. There is space for the EU institution to intervene, but on the other hand, it's up to every member state to decide, each national health policy. So again, we cannot blame the EU for not doing things that cannot be done by EU institutions.
Thank you, Eleonora, for the introductory remarks. I would like to remind our listeners and viewers that and encourage them, if they might have questions to our speakers, just feel free to write them down on our chat blog, and I might raise them during our conversation. So next, I would like to give the floor to Rem to give us a Dutch perspective from the EU.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's great to be in Budapest today. Although I'm really sad that I can't physically join you. I think this is a really timely discussion, but I also think that this is not the last time we're going to have a discussion like this. In the sense that some of the trends or issues that I'm going to raise are issues that the EU has been grappling with for the better part of the past, decade or decade and a half. And they are, in some respects, also structural in nature, in the sense that they reappear every time that there is a crisis facing the EU. And I think just before I get started, one opening comment to keep in mind is clever minds have said that the EU moves forward from one crisis to the next. And it's still anyone's guess what the EU will look like at the end of this crisis. We see a lot of doom mongers saying that this crisis is going to be the end of the European Union. Others say that this crisis is an opportunity for the EU to prove its real value. I mean, at the moment we are in the crisis, and as you know, more literary-minded people like to say that it's always the darkest before the dawn. So we don't yet know exactly what the impact of this crisis is going to be on the EU because we are still in it. But having said that, I think there are sort of three general phases we can identify that the EU has gone through since the start of the crisis, more or less 2 months ago. And let me just quickly walk you through them. The first phase was the start of the crisis, where national reflexes were very strong. And to a certain degree, these national reflexes still play a very important role today. We see that Schengen was suspended, borders have been closed, which is a quite astonishing development. The last time that happened was in the context of the migration crisis, but then it was only with a number of countries. Now we see effectively that the Schengen system has come to a standstill across the Union. We also saw in the first days of the crisis that the single market ceased to function as we would like it. It was sputtering to a halt almost, as certain countries, in particular, a number of Northern European countries installed export restrictions for certain medical equipment. And you know, the country that was particularly reported by the media to have done this with Germany with respect to certain medical equipment supplies for Italy. And that raised questions about, well, is the single market not crisis resistant? But the third point we saw very clearly, and Eleonora mentioned this, is that it became clear that the EU does not have a competence in health policy. And so it was not necessarily to be expected that the EU would take a leadership role from the start. And if you see that this is primarily a health crisis, and you note that according to the treaties, health policy is set by the member states and not by the Union, then what can you expect? And Eleonora already touched upon this. But this first phase was very much framed by national responses. And then the second phase, which more or less overlaps with the period we have right now, is that this crisis is intersecting with a number of issues that the EU was already grappling with to the extent that it was already showing degrees of tension among the member states, between the institutions, simply tough issues that the EU had not yet solved, and then the crisis intervened. And just to mention three, the discussion over the multi-annual financial framework was or is still ongoing, and the crisis now intervenes. The discussion over the implementation of the new Green Deal or the European Green Deal has not been sorted. It raises a number of questions in various member states, and the crisis intervenes. And the third example I'd mentioned, particular to a predominantly Hungarian audience, is the concerns that were there among a number of member states and institutions regarding the quality of the rule of law in a number of member states, most notably in Poland and Hungary. And that issue has not been resolved, and the crisis intervenes. And so the third phase, which you can identify, is that the EU, its member states, and the Commission are trying to respond to the crisis, but also trying to address a number of these trends that I've just identified that were still in the to be resolved box of the inbox of the European Union. And so quite quickly, as it became clear that the single market was shuddering to a halt, the Commission intervened and started to ensure that export restrictions internally in the single market were resolved. In fact, we now have a situation where there are no export restrictions inside the Union, but instead the EU has imposed export restrictions for sending medical equipment outside of the Union. So in effect, what the EU has done is made a number of these national export restrictions, has taken them to the EU level. The consequence of this has been positive to the extent that the single market has sort of been saved. Now, obviously, and I'm sure that we want to talk about this a little bit more extensively later on, is how the multi-annual financial framework intersects with the economic recovery plan. And despite the fact that this has not been resolved, we are still very much going through it. There has been a significant degree of attention paid to what an EU economic recovery plan looks like. The European Central Bank, of course, stepped in quite quickly with its debt purchasing program. And then there were the discussions, and I'm sure we'll get into this in the Q&A, over the extent to which the ESM would be used, or to the discussions regarding another fiscal stimulus package. But that obviously got stuck with some of the concerns that a number of particularly northern member states raised. And that has not been resolved, but it's not for lack of trying. And you cannot really blame the Commission for not delivering on something that the EU member states themselves cannot agree on. I mean, Ursula von der Leyen now has taken the MFF discussion and has said that she's going to launch a new MFF proposal. We now talk about Ursula's trillions, right? And then she's tried to take the discussion over a European economic recovery package and insert it into the MFF negotiations. And the jury is still out to what extent she's going to be successful. The third bit, which you can point to, where the Commission has been trying to regain the initiative is, and this may come across as somewhat banal or somewhat down to earth, but these are economically very important measures, is, for instance, what we saw come out yesterday in terms of a coordinated approach to removing lockdown measures. This particularly relates to the tourism sector. Tourism is a major economic sector for many EU member states, or for the EU economy writ large. And it's good that the Commission is trying to coordinate the opening up or the reopening of the Schengen border to allow the tourism sector to regain something of its former self. Again, it's very much an open question how this is going to develop, particularly as we do not know, as countries now come out of lockdown in a very slowly gradual phase, whether we're going to see a second wave in European countries or not. But I think it's fair to say that the Commission has been trying to regain its rightful place as a sort of a coordinator of European efforts in this crisis. But it's been troubled. It's very difficult for the Commission to do this, and I'm going to just raise 4 more points, and then I'll be quiet. It's been difficult to do this precisely for the reasons that I mentioned at the beginning, that there are structural problems that are confronting the European Union that now come out very clearly during this crisis. And they are structural. We've seen them in previous crises. We see the return of north-south and east-west tensions. We see the return of North-South tensions regarding the economic recovery package. We see East-West tensions in terms of rule of law, but also in terms of the MFF negotiations. We see a problem of solidarity and what solidarity means. Solidarity is viewed differently, whether you're talking from a perspective in Northwestern Europe, as opposed to if you are in Southeastern Europe. We see this, of course, very clearly again in the economic financial realm over the discussion of Eurobonds, where we saw a quite nasty exchange over particularly the Dutch position from a number of southern leaders from southern European countries. This makes it much more difficult, obviously, for the European Union to also come to a common position. And I'll be the last to say that I think that the Dutch position over the economic financial response package was very responsible. Then, of course, we see institutional battles. We see a potentially very toxic battle emerging now between the German Constitutional Court and the European Court of Justice. And this is relatively new, but because generally the German Constitutional Court is quite moderate in its criticism, but it's not new that there are institutional battles over levels of subsidiarity between national jurisdictions and European jurisdictions. And I think the final point I'd raise is that there are now questions, not just regarding solidarity and what it means in the European Union, but what also is fairness. And let me explain what I mean by that. As a consequence of the crisis, the European Commission has said that it's going to take a much more lenient approach to state aid regulation. So enforcement of state aid rules is viewed in a much more lenient way to allow countries to give support to their, the sectors that are harmed most. Now, the consequence of this is going to be, if the pessimistic scenario materializes, that wealthier countries are able to stimulate and support their domestic economic sectors much more than less wealthy countries in the European Union. In other words, that as a consequence, which makes sense at the EU level, to be a little bit more lenient in terms of state aid regulations in this time of crisis, the consequence may well be that we get greater inequality. Whereas the EU, of course, was meant to be a project of convergence rather than one of economic divergence. And so these are just some of the structural issues that I think the Commission and the EU will continue to struggle with. But like Eleonora, the jury is still out how the EU is going to emerge from this.
Thank you, Rem, for this very thoughtful, very rich initial introductory remarks. And now I would like to give the floor to Tamás to give us a perspective from Budapest.
Thank you, Gergely, and thank you for our foreign speakers to join us, not here in Budapest, sadly, but in the online realm. I think it is, we are living in very peculiar times. As far as I know, all the speakers are speaking from different countries. I pretty much think that it is going to be the new normal, at least in the year to come, maybe. I'm very glad to Gergely that you explained the Monty Python reference in your introduction, and yes, indeed, I think that those sentences said during the discussion in the movie are coming up and up again in particular segments of the public discussion, in various countries. Certainly in Hungary, it is the case. I think we have a really relevant topic in a very European round, and I would like to speak mainly about two things. First, mostly agreeing with the speakers previously said about the responsibilities and the competency issue between member states and the EU. And secondly, some of the concrete measures what the EU has taken so far. So first, let me just state that agreeing again with the speakers previously have spoken, that the member states are basically the main actors in the EU during the pandemic, at least in the first phase. It is clearly true. Healthcare has always been a national competence in the EU, as we have already heard, and so the national health care systems have basically the capabilities and the possibilities in the first place to respond to the pandemic. And these were also the member states who closed the inner European borders, and they were also who decided to stop the export of crucial medical equipment to other EU countries during the very early phase of the pandemic. But as Rem told us, now these are all changing. The non-sharing practice has already changed, and we are witnessing countries such as Germany and also, as far as I know, Austria, receiving patients from other parts of Europe, from France and from Italy, and also the non-sharing practice of medical equipment has also changed. Now, I can't even list the number of countries, number of member states who also exported medical equipment to other member states which are hardly affected by the virus. And also the coordination among member states began to open up the internal borders of the EU. As far as I know, the Baltic states agreed to have a mini Schengen among themselves, and they are going to open up their borders for each other starting tomorrow. And Germany will also open up their borders in a month, I think in the mid-June. And there are lots of bilateral agreements between several member states concerning how to open up the borders. So the situation in the EU has changed a lot since the beginning of the crisis, but still I believe that the lack of solidarity among the member states during the very beginning, the early phase of the pandemic, in the mid and end of March, will have a long-lasting mark on our collective memory. And I just want to quote or refer to one poll from an Italian institute called SVG from Trieste. I think it went quite high in the social medias, their results concerning how the Italians view member states as their friends, or if they are as their enemies. And in this poll I am referring to from mid-April, I think the public friend number one listed was China with 52%, and the public enemy number one was Germany with 45%. I hope very much that these sort of trends and opinions will change with time. But again, as I was stating, this hesitant, showing solidarity and lack of coordination and lack of sharing medical equipment with each other in the very beginning will have a long-lasting mark on our collective memory. Now, turning to the second point I would like to raise in the beginning, I would like to talk about what the EU has done so far. And as we stated that healthcare and health systems basically are is a national competence, I believe that the EU, and more specifically the European Commission's main task, is and will be in the future to help with the economic recovery. It was Ursula von der Leyen, if I remember correctly, who stated in a speech of her in mid-April that the collective response of the EU is worth 3 trillion euros. I don't know how how she got this figure, but again, I just want to list a couple of economic protection programs and packages the EU responded so far. It won't add up to 3 trillion, I promise, but again, these are concrete issues and concrete packages. First, there was the coronavirus response initiative investment initiative, which basically helps healthcare systems and small and medium-sized enterprises. A total of 37 billion euros. There was the European Central Bank's response, what Rem already mentioned, to purchase for an asset purchase program, 750 billion euros, which is also quite a big thing. And also the European Commission proposed the so-called SURE program to complement national efforts to protect the employment. Again, this is only what the packages are concerned. The second thing where the European Commission has certainly a role is to make the rules which defining our fiscal and monetary system, it basically got suspended. The very rules which defined all the Eurozone's spin and these which were really essential since we have something as a fiscal union. I'm talking about the Stability and Growth Pact and the state aid rules. These are all got suspended, or in Eurocrat language, they are using the full flexibility offering these schemes. And I think these were right decisions, but again, suspending these provisions should not be a one-way street. And it is going to be a very interesting discussion in terms of how can we turn back to normality, because now these got suspended, but who can say on what objective basis when the crisis is over and we should go back to the normality? What is the normality again? So I think it will be a very hard discussion how we can go back to the old day provisions. And one last thing I would like to touch upon is the MFF. My first comment is that although we are in an extremely unlucky situation concerning all the pandemic and the coronavirus, but it is still a lucky thing if we assume that if we would have the MFF agreed upon, like right now, or I don't know, in the months to come, and the pandemic would have come in the next year, we wouldn't have the flexibility from the MFF to react to the crisis and to adapt our economic response. So I believe that the MFF could be the main economic crisis response tool by the end of the day, simply because it doesn't have any legal problems such as with the Corona bonds. I think there will be tricky issues with the Corona bonds, also in light of the German Constitutional Court's ruling. I think there is going to be a lack of appetite from Berlin to issue instruments which could be on the legal basis very shady. But as Rem stated, it will still be a hard nut to crack concerning the divisions between the southern and northern European member states. And I think all eyes are now on the incoming German presidencies to see what they are proposing, and also what the European Commission would like to propose. I think I will stop here so we have enough time for the discussion. Yes, Gergely, the floor is back to you.
Thank you, Tamás. All of our panelists have touched upon the North-South divide, especially with regards to the economic and financial instruments the European Union already has or is developing in response to the pandemic, and to the economic crisis which is emerging out of the restrictive measures. My question would be aimed primarily to Eleonora and Rem with regards to the public perceptions and also the political leadership's perceptions and politics in general in the two countries, whether this crisis is truly a make or break moment in terms of what kind of agreement these two countries would be open to sign up to with regards to European solidarity? Or is it again just another some kind of crisis which the EU, and within that also the Netherlands and Italy and also Germany on the side of the Netherlands might accept as a situation where the EU just will muddle through in one way or the other, but no substantial strategic change will appear on the horizon as an agreement among all the EU member states. So how do you feel the perceptions and the public mood in this respect? First, Eleonora.
Thank you very much for the interesting question. Let me just say a couple of remarks before answering to what you asked. Well, I think, yes, this is going to be a make it or break it moment for the European history, and also for, I think, the extent and the role Italy is going to play within the European Union. The economic packages that have been put in place by European institutions until now are good. I think Tamás and also Rem were mentioning them. We have, the SURE plan. We have, state aid breakdown, escape clause from the state aid. We have flexibility on the Stability and Growth Act. We have the European Investment Bank and European Central Bank. But basically, all these financial aid are based on loans that member countries will have at some point to repay. The problem with Italy and also other Southern European member countries is that the impact of this unprecedented crisis is, first of all, huge. The crisis itself was unprecedented, and their financial shape is not in their best form already. So it means that maybe those European packages, yes, are going to help those countries to face next year, but then in the long term are going to basically destroy their economy. What does it mean? It means that this is also linked basically to why Italians seems to be more, to have more recognition of what China and Russia have been given to Italy than other European member countries. This is because the perception, the general perception that we got, not mine personal, but in the public, is that in moment of crisis, the European Union is never effective. There is an extreme lack of solidarity from European member countries, on the one hand. On the other hand, even when the European Union and member countries act in solidarity, there is no big communication about that. For instance, the case of Germany. Germany has been taking some COVID patient from Italian hospital to German hospital, but there were no basically communication about that, nor from the Italian side, nor from the German side, like very limited compared to what China and Russia have been doing in terms of media and communication. The best example is the Facebook page of the Chinese embassy in Italy, where there is the Italian and Chinese flag, and there is written China will help Italy, and the Facebook page of the European Commission in Italy, where there is nothing. So you see sometimes also this kind of basic communication will help to frame a perception of what someone is doing or what is not doing. Going back to the economy, I think, differently from previous crises, this crisis is not financial, is not linked to to the depth of the Italian economy itself. We touch, as Tamás was saying, I think, basic industry in Italy, like tourism and food and beverage industry, which are, among the most important industries in Italy. So I think we are already in a recession. Recession is going to hit hard the country. And on the other hand, Italy is one of the biggest economy within the Eurozone. So if Italy will fail, the consequences of this failure will be spread all over other European member countries. So again, the crisis of one country will have negative repercussion over the economy of the rest of the countries. So I think it is necessary to find an agreement where economic help will come to the countries that are most in need. Again, the problem is that if this maneuver will help Southern European countries economically and politically also, because it will overcome this big Eurosceptic wave, which is increasing again, the opposite will happen in Northern European countries where, you know, citizens, for instance, from the Netherlands or Finland or even Hungary will ask themselves why we are giving money to the Italians or the Spanish or the French. And it will be extremely difficult to explain to those citizens why it is right and why, you know, they should stay, they should support the European Union. Again, the problem is how to frame the message in both ways. But in the end, the solution is for member countries to agree on what kind of European Union they want to be, in the sense that we have been surviving crisis after crisis, hoping that, you know, things will go better, but it doesn't. We are living within an incomplete union where member countries are sometimes part of the Eurozone, sometimes they are not. Sometimes they think they want to have an increasing integration when it comes, for instance, to defense, but not when it comes to economic terms. And this doesn't work in the sense that every time there is a crisis, then we have to wait months to find, you know, a common position. And every time this common position is a common position that tries to accommodate all the requests, but is never effective itself, because, you know, by accommodating different position and different view, it cannot be effective. So for the times being, I think this is the most relevant moment, the times, you know, for deciding the multi-annual financial framework, to define, you know, what will be the future of the European economic policy, if there is a European economic policy, because for the time being, everything has been left to the European Central Bank to basically save the Eurozone. And this cannot be done in the future, also because the maneuver the European Central Bank have been doing in terms of quantitative easing and you know, buying basically national debts is not as effective as it used to be in the market, and they cannot be done forever, especially because we see Northern European countries that are not happy about this kind of policies. Now it has to be done because we are in an unprecedented crisis again, but still it cannot be done forever. So there is a need, and I think, you know, the ruling of the German court can be considered positive in one term, in the sense that it has somehow reshaped or refueled the need for debating about, you know, maybe the need to change the treaty and define if we want a more closer union or if we don't want a more closer union in the end, because this kind of hybrid organization, such as the European Union, is not effective when we need to move fast and take decisions. If we don't want this kind of organization, this has to be somehow stated. And then in the end, you know, there will be no need for discussing again, you know, about the responsibility of the European Union in terms of crisis, because each country will then, you know, deal with itself, and solidarity will be based on the will of each country, not given for granted. The problem with Italy and the Netherlands is that we come from two opposite visions of the economy and the market. Like, we have two different models of capitalism, which has been not accommodated in the years, in the sense that although, you know, being in the European Union and the Eurozone, we have common rules when it comes to fiscal capacity, etc. The way, you know, the market works and the way, you know, institutions are settled are completely different. So it's difficult to talk most of the time. The Dutch do not understand why, you know, our system is so inefficient in terms of bureaucracy, in terms of competition, and in terms of productivity. And it's very difficult for us to understand their position, in the sense that, for our understanding, is that if Italy is going to fail, they are going to fail as well, you know. So we always come to this kind of middle level where there is no common ground. Hopefully now, if Germany will be in the middle, we could find, you know, a way out of this. I think the response is the recovery fund, but the recovery fund, that has to be really recovering, in the sense that if it was going to be another loan at the expenses of countries that are using it, I don't think it will be effective in the long term. I think we need a European loan just for this crisis. This doesn't mean that, you know, we have to Europeanize basically national loan or national debts. Sorry, but again, providing, you know, aid through loans at national level will not be effective in the long term. This is my personal understanding.
Thank you, Eleonora. Rem, what is the Dutch public mood at the present with regards to how the EU should move forward on these issues?
Yeah, I mean, it's of course sort of the million-dollar question of how, in terms of us EU analysts, to make sense of national positions. What I'd say is the following. The discussion in the Netherlands is primarily focused on the Netherlands. There is relatively limited debate about what should be done at the EU level. And to be honest, I think that that's the same as most countries. One of the reasons why it's so strong in the Netherlands is that despite the fact that the Netherlands has been hit much less by the coronavirus than countries like Spain or Italy, and despite the fact that the lockdown measures in the Netherlands have been less far-reaching than those in Spain or Italy, if you look at the IMF's projections in terms of the economic downturn as a consequence of the pandemic, Spain and Italy sit lonely at the top. And then the third country that is hit hardest is the Netherlands. And now this is quite striking, I find, when we have a debate where we tend to juxtapose the rich and wealthy Dutch as opposed to the less wealthy Italians or Spaniards. I mean, it's true economically, but we also need to be realistic that in the Netherlands, there are huge concerns about what the impact of this crisis is on domestic production capacity and domestic services and unemployment rates and businesses that are going to fall over. And so it's tempting to frame the discussion as well, it's the stingy Dutch trying to tell that don't want to give money to the Southern European countries, but there is a domestic story to tell as well. And I think at the moment that predominates. But having said that, there is, I think, a general perception. No, I'm sure there is a general perception because that is against debt mutualization or steps towards a transfer union or steps towards endless loans in a Eurozone context. And the reason I'm so sure is that there is a parliamentary majority which explicitly tells the government not to sign up to that. And this, I think, informed the Dutch finance minister's quite blunt comments during the ministers of finance meetings over discussing the ESM recovery package. Now, you can blame Dutch Parliament for not being in tune with the mood in Southern European countries, and by all means, I think that it was a PR disaster for the Netherlands, the way in which the Dutch Minister of Finance expressed himself. But we shouldn't, again, forget that there is a domestic context at play as well. In the Netherlands, we're going to have elections in March. By all means, the election season has already begun. the Dutch Minister of Finance is one of the primary contenders to lead the Christian Democratic Party, a political party that has flirted with Euro-criticism on Eurozone issues for the past couple of years. And domestically, what he has been saying has gone down very well with his potential electorate. That's not to say that I think that it was very damaging for the image of the Dutch at a European level. And I think what particularly led experts like ourselves to raise eyebrows over the behavior of the Dutch was that it wasn't the Italians or the Portuguese or the Spaniards which were annoyed with the Netherlands. To be honest, that happens quite a lot. And that's not this isn't the last time, nor was it the first time. But what was striking was that there was a distinct difference of opinion between Germany and the Netherlands. And what happened then, after the ministers of finance reached their tentative agreement on the ESM recovery package, is that it went to the prime minister's level. And ultimately, I think that this is such a political hot potato that has such far-reaching consequences, far beyond the budgets of the member states or the management of the Eurozone. It really touches upon, I think, what Eleonora was also trying to say, the core of European integration and cooperation, that this can only be solved at the prime minister's level. And I would argue that at the prime minister's level, there is much more awareness, I think, of the specific circumstances in which a number of Southern European countries find themselves. And I would argue that the position of the Netherlands was moderate, much more moderate in, as opposed to the previous position of the Minister of Finance. So Prime Minister Rutte, I think, went out of his way not to antagonize the Southern European countries the way that the Minister of Finance did. But having said that, I'm not sure that there was a solution which is going to be satisfactory to Southern European states. I think ultimately, and perhaps it was Tamás that mentioned this, this is probably going to be an issue that's going to be resolved under the German presidency. Now, if I were a policymaker in Rome or in Madrid, that would lead me to be slightly worried, because ultimately I don't think that that's going to mean that every Spanish or Italian wish in terms of the economic financial rescue package will be put on the table. But at the same time, I don't think that the Dutch are going to get their way as well. I think both the Netherlands and Italy are going to be dissatisfied with the solution that the Germans will likely come up with. But I do think that the Germans will come up with a solution that is going to keep the EU more or less aligned. So I'm not as gloomy as Eleonora, perhaps, that I see this as a make or break moment. I think that there is still a lot of gas in the tank. I think one of the wise decisions that the European Council made was to not try to force a decision right now, to give it some time. They agreed on the 540 billion, which is available, but they said to give it some time to assess what exactly is needed and to allow discussions to take place about the modalities in which those funds should be made accessible, whether these are loans or grants or infinite loans or alternative measures or what have you. It's sensible to give this a little bit more time. Why? Because hopefully, right, fingers crossed, that the overall situation is going to improve a little bit. It's generally bad politics to make decisions under large amounts of pressure. And I think that that's what the European Council did. They gave themselves a little bit more time. Hopefully, the lockdowns are gradually going to come to an end, and that creates a little bit more breathing space, not just literally, but also politically, to reach a consensus view. Final comment, Corona bonds will simply not fly in the Netherlands. And that is going to be sort of an issue that Dutch politicians will fight to the teeth. And that's unfortunately the state of our domestic politics.
Thank you, Rem. To bring in Tamás to the discussion, one of the core questions when we are talking about the financial and economic instruments of the EU, and specifically about the MFF, of course, is how large the pie will be. So whether the amount of funds, of resources available for the EU's next financial framework will exceed the magical 1% of EU GDP. So how do you see and how all you see currently the debate between the so-called friends of cohesion, the more the less wealthier countries, and from Central and Eastern Europe and from Southern Europe, against the more richer countries of the so-called Hanseatic League, led by the Netherlands. So this debate will likely just intensify in the coming weeks. Where do you see the EU now moving forward on this issue? How does the current economic crisis impact this discussion? Tamás.
Sure. I mean, I can remember back then, I think it was February, when we started to initiate an analysis and wanted to write an analysis about the new MFF and the debates and what numbers are concerning, the net contribution of each and every member states. And then basically when the coronavirus hit in, we had to postpone everything because, now we have to completely replan the whole issue, and not just we as analysts, but also in the national capitals, those who are watching over the keys for the treasuries. So I think your question, I don't know if these are in the stars. I practically cannot answer that if it's going to be 1% of the GNI or 1.1%, but remembering how the debate was, I don't know, 3 months ago between the Council and the Commission proposed about 1.1, 1.2. The European Parliament wanted something more. I think, if I remember correctly from the debate a month before, they were proposing a 2 trillion euro budget for the MFF. I simply don't see that happening. I think it would be, an end of the day, a good old-fashioned European compromise, trying to avoid that the different parties from the different corners are losing their faces. And it is also simply, it is very similar to the debate what both Eleonora and Rem were talking about Corona bonds, no Corona bonds, if it's going to be loans or support. I think the compromises are, are in need, that could give ownership both countries like Italy or Netherlands, that they are both happy with the results. But I just don't see simply how this could happen, because the positions from as we speak at the time being are so divided. But it is not new thing, I think, in the European Union. Just as we remember back then, 2014, 2015, during the refugee crisis, the positions were also very far from each other. I'm not saying that at the end of the day we found a solution which are, everybody is happy with, but at least a group of states could, were happy with the solutions and found schemes and mechanisms that could work for themselves. 2 comments, if you allow, one for what Eleonora stated and one for what Rem. Eleonora was talking about communications issues that were coming up respecting the the offered help and medical export and so on and so forth. And why is that the Chinese and the Russians are so much better concerning communication than the Europeans? I think it is not a new issue. The EU has a propaganda problem. It is just propaganda, and we need better propaganda. And if they are not troll farms then in Russia, then we have to install more elf farms or something different, which we have to be able to communicate our positive results, because these are actually positive things, that patients got treated from Italy, transferred to Germany, or from France to Germany and Austria. I think these are big results, and then we just have to find our way how we can communicate these results better. And one comment to Rem. I think you rightly pointed out that these issues have to solve at the prime minister levels. And if we just think back the last 10 years, the continuous crisis from the financial crisis, and then the Euro crisis, and then the refugee crisis, I think the call was, at the end of the day, on the Council to decide how we proceed forward. And if they made an agreement, such as during the Euro crisis, like the economic firewalls and so on, it was the Council to decide. Or if we lack a decision and lack a common position, such as during the refugee crisis, and it was also the Council which was not able to decide how a common line should see. So I think you are right when you said that it is going to be at the Prime Minister's level to make a decision. I stated this earlier on, that the compromises are in need, that could give ownership for both ends and both parties. But last comment from my end, and then I will finish that. We all have different concept of solidarity. It was widely, and it was very obvious during the refugee crisis, and it led to huge debates between member states. My comment would be that it is a more philosophical issue maybe, that but I don't know if it's solidarity to ask something from the other side which you already know that it is not going to happen, or the other party is not going to fulfill it. So again, I do believe that we have to find a common solution at the end of the day, and it is a lot at stake, and Eleonora is absolutely right when she said that if the other member states are letting Italy swamp into debt, or leaving Italy with their problem alone, then how can other countries, let's say when it's about the eastern flank, I know it's mostly in the NATO sphere, but common defense is something which also European issue. How can we accept that other countries will ask for more European solidarity if we are not able to help or not willing to help? These are the questions. And now I'm turning I mute myself.
Thank you, Tamás. Eleonora and Rem, would you have a quick response to the MFF question?
Well, I would like to say a couple of words about solidarity. I think, the problem with solidarity is that it's based on basically goodwill, and we shouldn't, live the future of the Euro and the Eurozone and the European Union on goodwill of member states. I think there should be a common aim. If we set a common aim, a common rules, specific rules on economic policy and etc., I think we won't need solidarity as much as we need now. And the problem is that every time there is a crisis, then we talk again about solidarity, but it doesn't work because, again, it depends on the political situation of each country. As Rem was pointing, I agree with what we were saying. It's a political internal problem, the same in the case of Italy. Concerning instead the role of China and Russia and propaganda, what I think is that while the European Union is busy in doing what it is doing, of course, it's easier for China and Russia to just invest a lot in communication and act less in the end, because what the Chinese and Russians have been doing in Italy is like, I don't know, 1/4 of what the European member countries have done. But again, the perception is different. But the problem is not in the quality, on the better quality of the Chinese and Russian propaganda. I think the problem is that Italy was already, Euroscepticism in Italy was already growing before this crisis. You have to remember the migration crisis, as Tamás was pointing out. The perception, and actually I think also the reality, is that Italy was some kind of left alone in facing the crisis, and we were geographically unlucky in the sense that we found ourselves in the middle of this crisis, but very little help came by the majority of member countries, and this did not help in improving the European sentiments or the pro-European sentiments in Italy. And now we have this crisis. So I think there is need for action more than words from the European side.
Thank you. Rem, would you have a take on the pie, the common European pie?
Yes, but it's not a very sophisticated reply. The Dutch have taken a rather dogmatic approach to the MFF negotiations. And up until the pandemic hit, the Dutch were this group leading the Frugals, or they were called the Frugals. There was a very, I think, again, a quite damaging image of the Dutch in a European context when at one of the European Council meetings, the Dutch Prime Minister showed up with a biography of Chopin under his arm, walking into the European Council meeting and saying that he was available to be talked to, but he wouldn't. He was basically signaling, well, if countries have an offer to make, he was open to consider them. I don't think that helped in terms of the image regarding the Dutch over the MFF. I don't know to what extent this may have changed because of the coronavirus. I'm not aware that making the MFF now the vehicle to fund the recovery is going to soften the position of the Netherlands on the MFF. It might, if the Dutch come to the conclusion that all other avenues, for instance, the avenue of using the ECB, are closed because of the ruling of the German Constitutional Court. The Dutch will very much look to how to sell that domestically. So what was very interesting in terms of the agreement reached with regard to the ESM recovery package is that was viewed as a victory in the Netherlands because they, quote unquote, stopped Corona bonds. Corona bonds were never really on the agenda during the ESM discussions. That was something that was always over the horizon. If you're a Minister of Finance of a Southern European country, you can point to the ESM discussion and say, well, that's potentially a victory because we've now opened the door towards discussing alternative financial measures. And who knows what that might be? That might become Corona bonds. And so again, this is going to be politicized. Every compromise is going to be politicized. And every member state will want to spin it in a way that's acceptable to his or her domestic constituencies. What for me is very clear is that there will need to be more money than what we currently have on the table with the ESM. And I'm pretty sure that the Dutch government realizes this, but it's ultimately still a question of debate which instrument is most applicable to use it. So again, like I said, it's not a very sophisticated answer, but it's not clear cut how this is going to play out, I think.
Thank you. One of the issues which have been raised is China, and also to maybe a less limited degree Russia as well. We have also a question from the audience. What do you think if some European countries might receive help from these countries, from these external emerging powers? Does this help itself has the potential to carve negative image of the European Union in that certain country? And I would like to add another issue to this debate. How do you see the EU's approach towards China in general going forward? Previously, there was a plan to have a major EU-China summit in September. It might still take place, but certainly there has been increasing voices within the EU to be more careful with China. Last year, there was a commission paper which named China as a strategic rival for the first time. So there are increasing number of voices which raise even an alarm about growing Chinese influence and interference into European politics, even indirectly through economic measures, through investments into strategic sectors. How do you see now the EU's solidarity among member states with regards to forming a common policy and strategy to China? First, Eleonora, as Italy was certainly one of the countries which received a lot of help initially from China. Of course, as we know, much of that help was actually business-like deal. So Italy had already paid for those healthcare instruments and equipment, but still within Italy, it was certainly the issue was certainly politicized at a level which was maybe even unprecedented in other European countries. So what is your take on China?
Yeah, I agree with what you just said. The issue was very much politicized from one side to the other. I think I have two comments, one more general and one more specific to Italy. Let's start with the general comment. I think in the world we are facing, the fact that the US is kind of absent from, the international arena, from being, the global leader. Now it doesn't want to be the global leader that it used to be, let's put it in this way, or it doesn't have the means to be. But I think no one trusts or even wish China to replace the role of the US. I don't think China is in the position to replace the role of the US. And this applies then to specific contexts. In the context of Italy, what happened is that we have at the national level two very important, you can call it anti-establishment, you can call it populist, you can call it Euroscepticist parties. One is the Five Star Movement, which now is in the government, and the other is Lega, which is now in the opposition, but still is, I think, it has the biggest support. It has around 28% of the support. Well, Lega has a strong, you can call it love story with Russia. There were different scandals. Even there is some investigation about, Russia financing the party that still have to be verified. But anyway, there is a strong link between this party and Russia. And you can surely say that Lega is basically the bridge, the bridge for Russian to Italy. The Faisal movement instead is more linked to China. It supports somehow, business with China, but I would say that as far as business is concerned, it's fine. It's not that Italy has a stronger business connection with China than other European countries. Every European country is profiting of, the business opportunity with China. It's not just Italy. And I think Germany has a stronger linkage in this respect with China. What we need to do now is not to think about the propaganda those countries are doing in Italy. I think, as I said, the important thing is to think about what role Italy wants to play within the European Union and what kind of European Union we want to have in the future. It's important to point out the fact that propaganda is there, and there are citizens thinking in Italy that Chinese are doing more in helping Italy than the European Union. Is certainly a worrying element, but I don't think it's going to be a lasting element, in the sense that culturally and politically we are too far away, and this in the end will play a role. As far as the other question, I don't remember what you were asking. I'm sorry, I lost the I think you're on mute, sorry.
The question was basically about if a European country receives help from China or Russia, does that have the potential to carve negative image of the European country, of the European Union, sorry, in that certain country? So what kind of impact Chinese and Russian mask diplomacy has on the EU's image in general and in that specific country?
Well, I think, the European Union needs to deal with China because anyway, it's a regional power. We cannot just afford ourselves to not have relations with China. The important thing is to establish a clear agenda with Chinese. It is evident that, the fact that no one wants the European Union to become big actors in the global arena, and we should be aware of that. Nor the US, nor China, nor Russia. Having understood that, the important thing is to have relations with those countries, I think, but knowing that they're not our friends in this respect. So knowing the limits of these relations, that these relations should entail. Of course, it's important to have Chinese on board when it comes, to digital development or economic development, because anyway, they are a strong economy. I don't think it's a good idea to leave Russia on the corner, because anyway, Russia will enter in the European member countries somehow through propaganda, by invading some countries. Let's not hoping that won't happen. But anyway, I think we should also talk with Russia. And of course, we should maintain or try to maintain the relationship we always had with the US, although at the moment it doesn't seem the best, the best time.
Thank you, Eleonora. Rem, what's the Dutch perspective on China at the moment?
Well, that's a fascinating question. How long do you have? The Netherlands and China have very strong trade ties, but there are also some concerns which have recently emerged, not just because the Netherlands, as a member of the European Union, signed up to the EU's rather critical China strategy. Obviously, I mean, you gave, I think, a very clear summary of what's in it, the systemic rivalry, but the Netherlands itself published a China note, a China strategy of its own, in which it more or less takes a similar approach, where on the one hand, it wants to build closer ties on trade, but not too tight, that it needs to set up its own investment screening mechanism, that it has been, in an EU context, the Netherlands has been promoting the so-called level playing field instrument, which effectively makes it more difficult for Chinese state-owned enterprises to invest in the European Union. And so on trade issues, you actually see that though ties are close, that the Netherlands is taking a slightly more antagonistic line towards towards China, or wants more reciprocity in the relationship. But focusing a little bit on the impact of the pandemic on China-Dutch relations, I think something really interesting happened. One is that the Netherlands was very reliant in the first weeks of the pandemic on, like many other European countries, on supplies of face masks or other personal protective equipment from China. And China delivered on that. But what happened, and it's still anyone's guess why it happened, but one of the shipments of face masks or personal protective equipment was faulty. So these face masks could not be used in hospitals. And that led to a bit of rhetorical back and forth where the Dutch were blaming the Chinese were blaming the Dutch, and it didn't really help the relationship. What it effectively did is that it undermined something that we were discussing previously. It undermined China's propaganda strategy in the Netherlands, where it was really engaging in face mask diplomacy, where in an attempt to improve its image in a European country, it was using the example of the supplies of face masks as an indication that it was being, even though it was a friend far away, it was much better to have a friend far away in China than a neighbor which was not helping out, i.e. any other European country. And that image really was harmed by this incident regarding these faulty face masks. I have the impression that since then, also because of strong US lobbying in the Netherlands, that the balance is moving towards taking a slightly more, I would say, opposing view of China's behavior, a slightly more, say, American view. It's not binary. It's not 100% the case, but you see that American questions which are being raised about the origins of the virus, and that China was not very forthcoming in terms of sharing information, or that China was not a little bit sparse in sharing information about the first weeks of the outbreak in Wuhan province. That has started to percolate into the Dutch public opinion, and that there are also questions being raised. Well, is China telling the whole story? And this is now being connected to this question of freedom of the press, and we see very critical pieces appearing by the Chinese ambassador in Dutch newspapers. But at the same time, the Netherlands is being chastised by the Chinese because 2 weeks ago, the Netherlands decided to rename its diplomatic representation in Taiwan, which sparked some irritation in Beijing. In other words, the relationship is much less smooth than it was, say, a year and a half ago. And I actually think that the Corona crisis is going to act as a catalyst, which is going to make that relationship more difficult.
Thank you, Rem. Tamás, before I give the floor to you to have your short take on China, I would also raise my final question. Just if you could just have a look into your crystal ball, and in 1 or 2 years' time, do you see a more economically and financially more integrated European Union, or you would say that things will much look the same, or even some things will even disintegrate, or will even backslide, and the integration will be the integration project will be even in a greater challenge than it is today. So with that, first I would give the floor to Tamás.
Thank you for the easy question. First, I think I will take your question for the final question concerning the Delphi. You know, what the EU would look like in a year or 2 year time. I think what my gut tells, and it is really only my personal opinion, is that we will see more variable geometrics or multi-speed Europe as a result of the crisis. I don't know how it will look like. I see basically what we're all already talking about, you know, divisions and cleavages along north and south and east and west divisions. I don't see new trends coming. I see that the coronavirus was able to reinforce these pre-existing trends. And I think concerning, you know, there was already discussions and lots of developments on variable geometrics when it came to integration, how deep, with whom, security architecture of the EU, European intervention initiatives, and so on and so forth. The list goes on. So I think this is at least what my gut tells is going to be the way forward. On China, first I would like to quickly reply to the question from the audience. I don't think that you know, receiving help or aid from Russia or China itself is a tool to gain more influence. No one is talking about how Cuba is gaining more ground in Italy, and Cuba also sent medical help and doctors to Italy. No one is talking about, you know, increasing influence of Cuba and the Cuban leadership in Italy. In the beginning of the crisis, I had the impression that China is winning more ground, but in the meantime, I had to reassess my opinion. And I think in the meantime, we saw a lot of aggressive diplomacy coming from Beijing. If one looks at the website of the Chinese embassy in Paris, you see a lot of you know, ideological pressure and you know, complaints that the Europeans are not able to tackle the crisis because you know, their liberty and their freedom is more important than fighting back the virus. And these developments or issues are fitting very in the shape of what Joseph Borrell told about, you know, the global the global battle of narratives. I think we are really much in the phase of this global battle of narratives. And I'm not so sure that, you know, China is going to be able to make use of this crisis, although in the very beginning, the signs were that they can turn the table to their benefit. But what we see in in member states are quite different, although like when I compare Hungary to Austria, in both countries, you know, there was a lot of PR campaign. Politicians went to the airport to praise either if it's from the Austrian Airlines or Wizz Air when they landed on the respective on Svehat or at Ferihegy here in Budapest, and then, you know, they were unloading the masks and medical equipments from coming from China. But this is only the PR element, and what you know happened in real terms in these countries are quite different. If I stick to to this Austro-Hungarian comparison, then we have seen that in Austria the parliament passed a law making much more difficult for foreign investments coming into the country. They strengthened the FDI law in the country. And in Hungary, they passed the law which enabled for basically it's a BRI finance project in a record sum of the railway from connecting Budapest and Belgrade. So we are seeing very different responses from different member states. I think the Chinese were, in my opinion, successive to gain ground in the beginning, when there was a lot of confusion in the crisis management in the EU and the European member states. But in the meantime, my opinion is that because of this aggressive diplomacy, and then we can see, you know, what Rem was talking about, the intransparency, the lack of, you know, will how to make collective steps with the WHO on, you know, where this virus is coming from, and so on and so forth. This all generates a lot of distrust towards Beijing, and then I think at the end, I'm not so sure that they will be able to make this crisis to their own benefit.
If I may interrupt just very shortly, since Rem needs to leave, just a final take on the crystal ball question, if you might have.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. I have to leave at 4:30 sharp. But the crystal ball, gosh, ask me in a couple of years. No, the I mean, I think that the EU is going to muddle through, as it usually does. But there is a point where muddling through is no longer enough. And so, given the structural forces, which I've tried to elaborate on a little bit, which are pulling the EU in different dimensions, whether it's the question of rule of law inside the European Union, or whether it's the question of financial solidarity, or whether it's the question on how to deal with the migration crisis, which also is not resolved. Ultimately, this is going to be down to our domestic electorates, and I think that as these structural issues continue to be unresolved, domestic electorates are going to ask more and more inconvenient questions about the European project. And I just want to close by reminding that yes, we have populists in Italy. Yes, we have populists in a number of Central and Eastern European countries, but we also have Eurosceptic populists in the Netherlands. We also have elections coming up in March, which I reminded the participants of. And so this cannot just be a conversation about the North not wanting to bail out the South. We also really have to take into account the domestic political support for a number of the measures that we as analysts might think make sense entirely, but they need to be politically supported. And with that, I'm really sorry, but I have to leave you now. But thanks very much for inviting me to participate in this, and take care, everyone.
Thank you very much for your valuable contribution. Take care. Stay safe.
Sure. Thanks.
Eleonora, your take on the final question.
Well, the future, let's see. I pretty much agree with what Rem was saying, in the sense that I also think that we have to take into consideration what actually citizens want. But my perception is that the view we have, that citizens have about the European Union is most of the time shaped by national politicians. And when national politicians use the European Union as a scapegoat, of course you have an increase of Euroscepticism. At least this is what happened in Italy during the last years, not just with populist parties, but also with traditional parties. The future, hopefully, what I hope is that to see the EU responding to this crisis, to this unprecedented crisis in an unprecedented way, so through more integration. I think we need to step up with our challenges and find, a common solution, which, which has to be unprecedented itself, and there is too much at stake just to leave things as they are. I think there is the need to be brave and go forward, because otherwise the European project doesn't make sense, and it doesn't make sense not to have the European Union in this world, where you have global players which can basically very easily attack any member state standing by itself, digitally, electronically, and economically, and in whatever way you want. That's my final take.
Thank you, Eleonora. And well, it might be really worth to have a discussion on maybe a year's time on whether our predictions have been fulfilled. Hopefully, we could have maybe that discussion in person, maybe in Budapest or some other place. But I really look forward to continue this debate and discussion maybe sometime later on in this or some kind of other form. But with this, I would really like to thank our audience who have tuned in for this afternoon, and a special thanks for our speakers, to Rem Korteweg from Clingendael Institute, to Eleonora Poli from Italy's IAI Institute, and also to my colleague Tamás Molnár from Budapest from IFAT. And with this, I would just like to encourage all of our viewers and listeners to continue on looking at our website, at our Facebook page, to follow up about our events, about our webinars in the forthcoming weeks. Stay safe and wish you a pleasant afternoon.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye, thanks a lot.
Thank you.